if you're still there. I know it's been a long time since I've posted a Mad Sociologist in the News video. Quite frankly, after the last issue of In the News, an expose on dangerous knowledge, I was exhausted. To be honest, I'm still exhausted. Here we are struggling through an inflationary spike that's bringing in flashbacks from the 70s, and of all the flashbacks caused by the 70s, inflation is among the worst. Russia decided to break a long stretch of relative peace in Europe by invading Ukraine, a la Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia. The United Kingdom has put a dent in the European Union by listening to this guy. Yeah, that guy. We're counting down to an ultimate collapse of the global ecosystem, and to make matters worse, fascism is back. That, and I'm a teacher in Florida, for God's sake. So, like all of you, I'm a little bit mentally worn down. But now it's time to get back into the fray. I mean, after my home emerged from a Category 5 hurricane relatively unscathed, I figured maybe I should make use of my time. In the time I've been away, I've been trying to wrap my mind around our current situation. Then trying to figure out how to formulate an effective analysis that offers some different and useful perspective, then summarize that analysis in a 15 to 20 minute video essay. We'll see how that works out. If you're a student of history, you know the story. After a period of relative stability, we become complacent in that history has reached a resting point. Then history wakes up and wrecks the calm. Stability breaks down. We experience crisis, uncertainty, even tragedy and calamity. Ultimately, however, leaders emerge and institutions organize, rise to the occasion, and guide us through the crisis. At the hand of these wise stewards, we emerge from the crisis, stability restored, and history and humanity more advanced, if only a little bit. So, hello? Is this thing on? Sorry, folks, the cavalry isn't coming. There's no Superman emerging from the phone booth. There's no Lincoln emerging from the throng of political elites. And no, this guy is no Lincoln. Neither is this guy. And this uninvited crotch grabber? Yeah, we're on our own. In the past, this feature has focused on issue politics, police abuse of power, immigration, education. I used to have a healthcare video, but Don Henley made me take it down. This time, however, I feel there's way too much to cover in the time I've been away. I figured I would take this first video back to do a broad sweep analysis. How do we understand where we are in context to where we've been and the state of the structures that are in place to help us deal with crisis? That's right, I want to talk about our dreadful political situation. We find ourselves facing a convergence of historical forces. Technological advances are challenging our culture and value systems. We're feeling the first blows of global climate change. Waves of refugees are straining immigration systems. The strains of a globalized economy that leave us vulnerable to supply chain disruptions and authoritarian governments is coming to a head. All over the country, working people struggle to break even, let alone get ahead. The social contract has been torn. Everywhere we look, it seems like life as we know it is under threat. And to be clear, it is. In short, what we're witnessing is the breakdown of the liberal world order that we've taken for granted for about a century. Let me explain. First, what do I mean by the liberal world order? The liberal world order emerged from two social forces. First, a brutal and colossal transfer of colonial and imperial wealth into Europe, stewarded by the European merchant class, gave rise to modern economics in the form of capitalism. Secondly, this rising bourgeois class embraced an expanding social discourse of reason, science, and political liberalization. This discourse emerged from social movements now referred to as the Enlightenment. Capitalism and Enlightenment philosophy, often at odds with each other, became the bedrock of liberalism. By the end of the 19th century, liberalism was ascendant. It was an unstoppable social movement that brought with it significant advances and benefits to humanity. It ushered in a scientific revolution coinciding with improvements in economic efficiency and expanding global markets. Standards of living increased, human health and vitality improved. The entire world was geared toward progress if only it embraced the liberal world order. Of course, this progress came with an awful cost. Capitalism is premised on the exploitation of workers and resources. The great wealth accumulated by capitalists was often accomplished by passing on the human costs of growth to others. Slavery, genocide, environmental degradation, periodic economic collapse and instability, nation-state competition perpetuated the most catastrophic wars humanity has ever known. These were the wages of the advancements of liberalism. But liberalism has always been a progressive movement where there's exploitation and abuse. People organize for justice and reform. By the late 19th century, workers and other marginalized groups were using liberal discourse to demand greater, more democratic power. Progressive movements organized around labor, liberty, suffrage, childcare and education, healthcare, peace, conservationism, the environment. It was impossible to escape the dehumanizing aspects of liberal capitalism, and every generation seemed dedicated to doing something for improving the lives of everyone. Liberalism, with its contradictions, has always been a work in progress. Despite our problems, most people within the liberal world order knew that tomorrow would be a little bit better than today. We all knew that eventually humanity would find solutions to the nastiness that plague us and create a world where we can take to the stars and earn a well-deserved seat at the Intergalactic Congress of Sentient Life Forms. A recent example of this kind of progress is the advancements we've made towards sexual and gender diversity. When I was a young person, someone my age coming out as gay, well, it rarely happened. Someone coming out as trans never happened. We had an effective culture of fear that suppressed those who did not align with accepted heteronormative behavior. In 1969, New York City experienced a week of rioting in response to state-sanctified harassment and repression of queer people, sparked by a raid on the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village. 40 years later, the result of decades of activism and cultural debate, the Supreme Court declared same-sex marriage is protected under the United States Constitution. Public opinion of same-sex marriage flipped from overwhelming opposition to overwhelming support. Today, my classes are a rich panoply of straight and gay, cisgendered and transgendered young people who get along just fine. I don't want to whitewash it. There's still challenges and bigotry, but that oppressive culture of fear is certainly a tattered fabric as compared to the heavy blanket it used to be. Despite clear cultural advances, there is a pall hanging over us, all of us. This is a global pall, all over the world. It seems that the regressives are making advances and the progressives are on the defense and losing ground. Aspiring autocrats like Narendra Modi in India and Viktor Orban in Hungary are consolidating power in nations that once aspired to democracy. Vladimir Putin is channeling Adolf Hitler and invading Europe's largest nation, Ukraine. Conservatives in the United Kingdom withdrew from the European Union, weakening one of the most significant multinational experiments in the history of the world. China, after significant advances, is now retrenching into autocracy under Xi Jinping, actively cracking down and destroying all vestiges of democracy in Hong Kong. These aren't just selective anecdotes. Freedom House reports a 15-year decline in global freedom, noting that the countries experiencing deterioration outnumbered those with improvements by the largest margin recorded since the negative trend began in 2006. The long democratic recession is deepening. According to Freedom House, 75% of the world's population lived in nations that experienced a deterioration in freedom. These results are confirmed by the Institute on Democracy and Electoral Assistance. IDEA states that half of the world's democracies are in decline. The United States is no exception to this rule. Freedom House marks an 11-point reduction in its freedom score between 2010 and 2020, putting it among the most significant democratic declines in the world. IDEA defines the United States as one of many backsliding democracies. The Brookings Institute reports that 1 in 5 Americans are open to or supportive of authoritarianism. Morning Consult puts that number at more than 1 in 4. The National Security Council reports that racial, ethnic, and religious hatred, as well as anti-government extremism, are key elements driving domestic terrorism. Furthermore, the United States now has more guns than people, a driving variable for interminable mass shootings, forcing us to restructure our lives around the possibility that at any moment we might be sprayed by bullets. All of this culminated on January 6, 2020, when right-wing fanatics, insisting against all evidence that the presidential election had been stolen, stormed the Capitol building with the expressed intent to assault and even kill our elected representatives and Vice President Mike Pence. What the heck is going on? Liberal philosophy emerged to dominate as a result of the rising power of the bourgeois or merchant class, but it has been sustained by a story of human progress that could be legitimized by human experience. Unfortunately, that's no longer convincing. Economically, more and more Americans are feeling the pinch. Wages have been stagnant for over 40 years. Meaningful, stable, and well-paying jobs, especially working-class jobs, have been outsourced, offshored, and automated, leaving only soul-sucking, low-wage, dead-end work in the service sector. Every year, it gets harder and harder for average working people to get by. For the first time in modern history, young people will most likely fare worse than their parents and grandparents. Meanwhile, even life expectancy among working-class men is declining. In the meantime, the rich are now obnoxiously wealthy while barely breaking a sweat. The fortunes they amassed vastly outweigh the benefits they bring to the table. Politically, it is clear that our governing institutions are no longer representative in any meaningful sense. A famous study from 2014 by Martin Gillids of Princeton University and Benjamin Page from Northwestern simply wrecks any illusion that the United States government is at all responsive to average people. They concluded, quote, when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near-zero statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. End quote. In other words, Congress doesn't pass popular legislation unless it gets the thumbs up from the economic elite. Our system is rigged against the demos in favor of the economic elite, and there seems little reason to believe that this arrangement will improve over time. Take, for example, our current inflationary crisis. The inflation crisis was the result of supply chain disruptions resulting from COVID, as well as the immense government spending required to keep the economy from collapsing. Inflation was further exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and a global shortage of microchips. Furthermore, even as these pressures ebb, corporations with monopoly power continue to keep their prices high in order to make even more obnoxious profits at the expense of working people. What didn't contribute to inflation was rising wages and how well off working people were becoming. In fact, wages have mostly lagged behind inflation. Inflation disproportionately hurts working people and low-income people the most. An 8% increase in prices is a much higher percentage of income for working class people than it is for the wealthy. However, inflation also discourages investment, so clearly something has to be done. Well, what are the available solutions for dealing with inflation? Brace yourself. They all involve hurting working class people. To bring down inflation, buying power must be reduced to bring demand in line with supply. The first strategy is what's called contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy means raising taxes and cutting government spending. In essence, the goal is to run a budget surplus and just keep that money locked up in the Treasury. Well, raising taxes isn't going to happen, so the bulk of the contractionary policy must be to cut spending. Most federal spending is in the military, but that won't be cut. So that leaves Medicare, healthcare, and Social Security, all things that working class families rely on. But fiscal policy is not a sharp enough tool to bring down inflation. The strongest tool at our disposal is tight monetary policy. In other words, the Federal Reserve raises its interest rates to discourage borrowing. Borrowing is how the economy grows. Investors borrow money to start businesses or grow their businesses. People borrow money to buy homes and cars. When the Fed raises its interest rates, this makes borrowing more expensive and therefore riskier. Businesses don't start or expand. People don't buy houses or cars. The economy slows down. The wealthy are encouraged to hold on to their money as savings. No net loss for the wealthy. But for working people, this means that fewer jobs and lower wages and benefits. Meanwhile, there's no effort aimed at reducing corporate monopoly power, a factor that really did contribute to inflation. The Economic Policy Institute reports that corporate profits contribute to over half of existing price increases. Labor costs, on the other hand, only account for less than 8%. Yet the Fed's strategy is to go after those increased labor costs. Almost nobody in either party is suggesting going after corporate profits. Instead, working people, those who benefit the least from our economy, are expected to pay the cost for fixing the economy, with absolutely no guarantee that they'll benefit in the future. This is not a bug in the system. It's the system. Here's Fed Chairman Jerome Powell responding to Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Let's talk about what the Fed is and isn't doing when it raises interest rates to try to bring down inflation. Let's start with gas prices. The price of gas is up 40% since Russia invaded Ukraine in February. Chair Powell, will gas prices go down as a result of your interest rate increase?
I would not think so, no.
Okay. Let's look at another necessity, food. Price of groceries is up nearly 12% this year. Americans feel the pinch. No matter how much groceries cost, people still got to eat. Chair Powell, will the Fed's interest rate increases bring food prices down for families?
I wouldn't say so, no.
Okay. Chair Powell, you said last week that interest rate increases, quote, moderate demand. Can you just explain a little more about what that means?
Sure. So we think about interest rate increases as affecting financial conditions and then the economy through three broad channels, the first of which is interest-sensitive spending. So that's durable goods and automobiles and things like that. So interest rates go up, people's demand for, as a result of higher interest rates, will moderate or decline so that supply and demand can get into better balance. The second channel is just asset prices generally. Interest rates, as they go up, will cause asset prices to moderate across the economy, and people spend a little bit less out of their lower level of wealth. The third channel is the exchange rate, which is really just another asset price, and that just basically as the dollar strengthens, as rates go up, the dollar would strengthen, which would tend to drive.
So I appreciate this, and I do appreciate the explanation, but let me just see if I can just put a little more plain vanilla explanation of what's going on here. If I understand what you've said and what economists are saying across the board is that when you raise interest rate, there's going to be less money to invest, and that is, it's going to dampen business investment. Is that a fair statement?
I think the idea is to
Makes it more
moderate
expensive
demand
to invest.
so that it can be in better balance with
Okay.
supply. In
So
the current
it's gonna make it
situation,
more-
demand is well in excess of supply in some areas of our economy.
More expensive to invest, which in turn is going to throw workers out of work. And when they're out of work, they have less money to spend. So I get that rate increases stop companies from spending money to build new plants or to buy new trucks or to hire new people. Right, Chair Powell? When money's more expensive, they're less inclined to do that. I think that's what you just said on asset pricing, right?
Well, in the labor market, you have, as you know, you have a situation where there's a shortage of workers, and there are two job vacancies for every person who's actively looking for work. So part of this is to get the labor market back into balance.
Well, I appreciate you call it back into balance. What I'm trying to get at, though, is what does the tool of raising rates do? And part of what you just said is that it increases, in effect, the cost to invest, to buy those trucks or new plants or to hire new people. The reason I raise this and the reason I'm so concerned about this is rate increases make it more likely that companies will fire people and slash hours to shrink wage costs. Rate increases also make it more expensive for families to do things like borrow money for a house. And so far, the cost this year of a mortgage has already doubled. Inflation is like an illness, and the medicine needs to be tailored to the specific problem. Otherwise, you could make things a lot worse. And right now, the Fed has no control over the main drivers of rising prices, but the Fed can slow demand by getting a lot of people fired and making families poorer.
Look, folks, the game is rigged, and we all know the game is rigged. So how did we get here? Well, in short, neoliberalism. Let me explain. After generations of social activism from the 1930s into the 1970s, governments in advanced countries all over the world followed some variation of social democracy. In other words, they had capitalist economies that generated significant wealth, but capitalism was regulated to mitigate some of its inherent abuses like worker exploitation, environmental destruction, unsafe working conditions, and so on. Furthermore, redistributive policies were in place to deal with the economic inequality that goes hand in glove with capitalism. In other words, wealthy people carried most of the tax burden, and these taxes were invested in social welfare, income insurance programs, and public goods. In the United States, social democratic policy was born from the New Deal responses to the Great Depression and then World War II. In other words, as liberalism expanded, its emphasis shifted from capitalism to democracy. This was not automatic. It was the result of social activism. Economic elites bristled. After all, high taxes, regulations, and labor empowerment all impact their bottom line. Furthermore, in the 1950s and 60s, there were increasing demands on the government to get involved in civil rights. The New Deal was a significant boon to the white working class, but often excluded people of color. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, what became known as the Great Society intended to amend the New Deal so that the benefits of a wealthy economy would accrue to everyone, regardless of color, gender, or ethnicity. For many among the economic elite, it was bad enough that a portion of their gains was going to working class whites. That their tax money might go to, those people was just more than they could bear. Conservatives always hated the New Deal, and make no mistake, it wasn't about government intrusion in the free market. Conservatives have no problem with that, so long as that intrusion benefits economic elites. Now, conservatives hate social democracy because these programs cost them money and empower and liberate working people. Empowered and liberating working people are difficult to control and exploit. Unfortunately, such policies also tend to be popular. Dismantling popular social democracy wouldn't be easy. It would require a rhetorical frame. In other words, a story that could undermine its popularity and shift the emphasis from democratization back to capitalism. American conservatives found this story in the theories of Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek and later American economist Milton Friedman. The rhetoric was simple. Government regulation of the market was nothing more than the first step towards socialist tyranny. Furthermore, if not for government intrusion in the market, everyone who was willing to work hard enough would be able to become rich. It's these government programs that take the hard-earned money from the deserving and distribute it to those people. The 1970s saw a crisis that was too good for conservatives not to exploit: stagflation, a period in which high inflation corresponds with a weak economy. I don't want to get into the weeds on what caused stagflation, as this video is long enough already. It's important to note, however, that economic instability in the 1970s also corresponded with the collapse of political legitimacy resulting from seemingly endless government scandals, not the least of which was Watergate. It sure looked like the government wasn't holding up its part of the social democratic bargain. So when a fellow named Ronald Reagan ran on the mantra, "Government is not the solution, government is the problem," it sure resonated with Americans. He became president in a landslide with a mandate for change. Reagan's reforms, as well as those from other conservatives like Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, evolved into what we now call neoliberalism. The idea was to get the government out of the economy as much as possible by cutting taxes, deregulating, and disempowering labor unions. This means that popular public goods and services could no longer be funded. Not to worry. According to guys like Milton Friedman and James Buchanan, the private sector could provide these goods and services more cheaply and more efficiently than the incompetent government. So privatization became central to neoliberalism. Reagan's rhetoric, embraced by corporate media, was so powerful that by 1990, neoliberalism was the established political discourse across the spectrum. Republicans tended to be more aggressively neoliberal. Democrats, having been taken over by the neoliberal Democratic Leadership Council, were at least willing to preserve Social Security and Medicare as public services. Any suggestion that the government act in the public interest, however, was castigated as socialism, and when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, socialism went out of fashion. There was no debate between neoliberalism and social democracy. The only question was just how virulently neoliberal we were going to be. For more than a generation, we've been sold a neoliberal bill of goods by both parties. First, government presence in the marketplace is akin to socialism, and the only thing that could come from socialism is economic stagnation, collapse, and even tyranny. If we want to be prosperous and free, we need to get out of the way of business and unloose the awesome power of the market, and prosperity will rain down. But it won't rain down on everyone. It will only rain down on the deserving. If you work hard and develop marketable skills, you will thrive. If not, well, then you don't deserve to prosper, and certainly you can't expect other people who have worked hard to pay your way. No need for democracy and rights. Access to the unfettered market was all that was necessary to guarantee freedom. That was the new bargain that the American people made. Furthermore, it seems we've exported this mentality to other countries. Even solid social democracies like Sweden are facing challenges from the neoliberal consensus. It is now undeniable that this bargain was a con. Neoliberal free trade agreements busted the unions and reduced vast swaths of what used to be prosperous cities into rust. Wages stagnated, higher education, healthcare, and housing became unaffordable. The entire economy became dependent on private debt. In 2008, the whole edifice came crashing down. Speculation and unregulated shadow banking led to the greatest financial collapse since the Great Depression. Over-leveraged finance companies were on the verge of collapse and threatened economic Armageddon. Stalwart free market government isn't the solution capitalists did what they always do under such circumstances. They cried to the government for a solution. And they got it. Our elected representatives across the spectrum stumbled all over each other to approve hundreds of billions of dollars in bailouts. The Federal Reserve committed itself to buying out countless garbage bonds and swallowing them, all to keep the corporate elite afloat, and so-called free market conservatives and neoliberal moderates couldn't wait to write the check. Meanwhile, millions of Americans lost their homes to the very finance companies being bailed out. Right-wing neoliberal politicians, the ink not even dry on the checks they wrote to big business, explained that they couldn't be expected to bail out irresponsible home buyers. What do you think this is? Socialism? Moderate neoliberals were little better. Their response was, meh, what are you going to do? There were some half-hearted measures, but working people got nowhere near the same robust bailouts that the super rich received. We were on our own. In 2010, we learned just how much the corporate elite had learned from the Great Recession. We got an up-close and personal look at how humble they were in having to turn to the reviled government for help. They applauded themselves for a job well done, lavished themselves with exorbitant bonuses in the name of quality retention. It would have been hard to save American families during the Great Recession. Using the same strategy it used to buy up worthless bonds from the wealthy, the Fed could have bought up underwater mortgages from struggling Americans and restructured their loans to keep them in their homes. That this didn't happen is a clear indicator of where the loyalties of the state lie. So since 2010, at the very latest, it has been impossible to hide from the fact that the system constructed by neoliberalism, the existing liberal world order, simply does not work for average people. And this is true in every country in the world that has embraced neoliberalism. It does not work. Furthermore, it's important to note that neoliberalism is functioning exactly the way it was intended to function. It is not the case that something has gone wrong and needs to be fixed. No. The problem is neoliberalism, and by extension, capitalism in general. And it is now impossible to hide this singular fact. It is clear to everyone, regardless of station, regardless of politics, that the status quo has failed. Where does that leave us? When existing systems no longer meet the needs of the people, and existing discourses or the stories we tell about the world around us no longer motivate our actions, the people start looking for alternative stories. With this in mind, there are two possible alternative stories, or what we can call deep stories, that can be told. One story is mythical. The other story is utopian. Look, a dog magically appeared in my hands. The mythological deep story is embraced by the right wing. It's a story that exalts past greatness. The deep story goes like this. Once upon a time, Land was great. It was wealthy and prosperous. It was powerful and feared. It was a center of art and culture. Everyone respected the Falalans. Wherever they went, people would point and say, "Wow, I wish I were a Falalan so I could be great too." But then the reformers and the liberals came in and attacked Falaland's traditional values. They weakened traditional institutions like the military, the police, and the church with their woke policies. They tolerated heretical views and atrophied beliefs. Furthermore, they allowed those people, the non-Falalans, to have too much power. Now the non-Falalans can just sit around and suck the tit of the state while real Falalans do the work and pay the taxes. Hark, the dog disappeared. Hey, if we want to make Land great again, we have to go back to that time when it was great. We have to embrace the old traditional values. We need to protect Land from those people and sever our ties to other less exceptional countries. True Falalans want their country back. Of course, this view of Land's epic past is fiction. Yeah, Land was powerful and wealthy, but the myth elides the downsides, the exploitation, the violence, the excluded. The other story is utopian and is embraced by the left, including myself if I'm being honest. It's the story of a democratic world in which everyone, regardless of ethnicity, gender, background, or education, has a voice in all things political and economic. Optimally, the workers own and control the means of production. Government is conducted through democratic processes for the purpose of stewarding the commons and guaranteeing the delivery of public goods that will improve the lives of all. It is a clean, free, and just society liberated from want and dedicated to human flourishing. Look, both of these stories are aspirational, premised on dreams, theories, and rhetoric. When systems break down and no longer serve the needs of the real people, these stories become influential. Either we're motivated by delusions of a mythical past when everything was going right, or we're inspired by dreams of a future unlike any we've ever experienced. Of the two stories, however, that embraced by the right is the easiest to envision. Why? The left vision seems pretty nice to me. Well, of course it does. First, right-wing mythology has the appeal of familiarity. It's hard to envision a utopian future, but a mythical past, well, we see that all the time. It's on television, in the movies. It's the Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver vision of the United States. The golden age of the 50s when the United States was at the top of the world. We're all familiar with the iconography. When MAGAs talk about making America great again, they're calling upon images of mom making cookies and dad going to work at the mill and making enough money to raise the kids in a nice house in the burbs with a white picket fence. The vision is bullshit. It's bullshit on multiple levels. First, the 1950s golden age was born by New Deal policies. Dad was able to afford that house with the white picket fence because he had a solid, well-paying union job and he qualified for an FHA loan and traveled to work on federal highways or state-subsidized rails. Furthermore, he was white. The golden age of the 1950s was denied to just about everyone who wasn't a white male. Black families were specifically excluded from that neighborhood. Also, Mom didn't really want to bake cookies. She wanted to be a scientist and would much rather be married to another woman than this guy. But those opportunities were not available to her. But at least the right has a comfortable and familiar iconography upon which to draw. Even though their vision is aspirational, they have a model. They have video footage that they can show and say, this is what we want. The left does not have this benefit. There's no good existing iconography that the left can draw from to explain the world they want to build. And the left does not do a particularly good job of drawing the picture for the larger public. To a certain extent, the left has become weighted down with academic flurgablick language that nobody understands and tends to get caught up in the micro issues of identity and injustice and how these things are bound up in nebulous constructs of systems analysis and... Don't get me wrong, identity and injustice are important, but it's also important to have a larger vision that everyone can relate to and a story that everyone can embrace. It's easier to envision the end of the world than it is to envision the end of capitalism, but that's the story the left has to figure out how to tell. The best iconography we have to demonstrate a world without capitalism is Star Trek, where replicators that rearrange molecules to provide for human needs solved the problem of scarcity and thus ended capitalism as we know it and freed humanity to pursue self-fulfillment. Okay, but that seems pretty far away. Leave It to Beaver was just yesterday. The second problem that the left has is the memory of the Soviet Union. Yeah, I know. The Soviet Union is not an example of socialism because socialism is a democratic movement and the USSR was authoritarian. That's fine. But you're preaching to the choir. For millions of Americans, when the word socialist or leftist is brought up, the gray food lines of the Soviet Union is the archetype that emerges in the mind. On the other hand, the actual policies that the left embraces are all very popular. Healthcare for all, higher education for all, higher wages, jobs for everyone who want one, an environment fueled by alternative energy. Unfortunately, people are not really motivated by policy debates. They're not motivated by statistical analysis, data sets, or the labor theory of value. People are and always have been motivated by stories. Before the New Deal and the post-war prosperity and footage of Soviet poverty, it was possible to use stories to create a vision of a bright democratic future. There was no competing vision. The left had an advantage. Today, that's no longer the case. We have to find new ways and new stories to engage people into working for the future we know is possible. Look, as it stands, there are three stories of our future. In the first story, moderates figure out how to make the existing system work. We rebuild on the ruins of social democracy and enjoy a tightly regulated and redistributed capitalism. History suggests that this is nothing more than a temporary measure. Economic elites will chip away at the gains made by the demos until we're right back to this point. The second story is fascism. We know how that ends. The third story involves building a democratic political economy based on tolerance, reason, and empathy. It shouldn't be hard to tell that third story, but somehow the left can't seem to do it. There's only so far the left can go by running against the right. Unless the left has a coherent story that can appeal to everyone and that can be embraced by the larger population, we're always going to be in the margins.